Hey, this is the Proactive Podcast. We break down the body and its biomechanics from the lens of athlete-centered chiropractors. We're recording here from Proactive Health Group, a clinic down in downtown Calgary, Beltline District. So, my name is Dr. Matthew Jurgis, and I'm here with
Dr. Alex Fitzowich.
And Dr. Kevin C.
All right, and today we are breaking down what we'd like to call foundational movements, right? So what does that even mean, Dr. Alex?
So the two foundational movements that we're going to be talking about today are the squat and the deadlift, or the hip hinge. And really what makes these the foundational movements is these are the two things that contribute to every single sport, every single movement. Basically everything that you do with your lower body is going to have some combination of this squat and this hinge pattern. And so really, anytime you're bending down or picking anything up in front of you, that's that hinge, right? Your hips go back. Anytime that you need to get a lot lower, you're going to do that squat. You're going to bend your knees, bend your ankles, all those kind of things. And so everything else is kind of a variation between those two. It's a combination. That's why they're foundational movements.
Yeah, so like pretty much in your lower body, that's where you find some your biggest muscles, like your quads, your glutes, your hamstrings. And so the interplay and the patterning of how you activate all those muscles, it becomes quite foundational in quite everything you do.
Yeah, and they're foundational in almost several ways, and one of them is that these are the most compounded movements. And what I mean by that is if your body and its musculoskeletal system is a bunch of pulley systems that work together, to complete these movements, everything needs to kind of work in sync. And it just incorporates a lot of your body working together under one roof to enact these, perfectly.
And it is really just the most efficient way to kind of move your body. Like Dr. Kevin was saying, your glutes are the biggest muscle in your body. You have your quads, your hamstrings, your hip muscles, all these big muscles. You want them to be doing all the work for you, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even you can think of it foundationally as in how do babies develop, right? Well, first you learn how to roll and crawl, right? That would be considered foundational, but not only that is watch a baby squat, and DNS is a branch that kind of goes into it, a specific discipline of studies. But a baby squats perfectly every time, and deadlifting pretty well the same. It's because they need to be able to incorporate their core before they can use their extremities. And
right.
The way to do that, right, they first learn how to master their core, and then everything goes out. But as we get older, we get lazy and start relying on our extremities to do the work, and we don't really pull it all together. So another aspect of why this is foundational is the core control.
Yeah, definitely. With the core, essentially what you're trying to do is, in order for your arms or legs to move properly, specifically your shoulders or your hips, is they need something to push off of, if that makes sense. And so what you do when you're bracing your core is you get a nice firm brace and you give something for your legs to develop power off of, or your arms to develop power off of, right? Because that hip socket and that shoulder blade, both of those are either connected to or close to the core. And what the goal is to be able to activate those muscles in order to stabilize your trunk and make it nice and rigid, make your torso nice and rigid, so that you can move all your extremities and accomplish whatever goal you're trying to accomplish.
So pretty much having an anchor that
Exactly.
you can move your limbs on, whether be it your legs or be it your arms.
I heard a good analogy, and it's trying to fire a cannonball out of a canoe. Maybe you said that.
Yeah, that's a great one. I like that one.
Right? If you have a weak core, let's say you're trying to pitch or whatever,
Right.
or even run, sprint.
Yeah.
You're trying to fire these huge muscles, and you don't have
Any stability to go
any
against.
stability. Yeah. So Alex really simplified this core thing into a perfect kind of paraphrase or or a little script here when he said this earlier, preventing pelvic tilting. So what does that mean exactly?
Okay, so if you think of your core as a barrel, right? You want the core to be able to transfer forces both up your torso, down your torso, and your legs, and then also that force needs to be distributed all the way around as well. And so what we find a lot of times through either posture or issues with technique or a lot of tight muscles, asymmetry, that kind of thing, is the top or the bottom of that barrel gets kind of tilted, and they're no longer perpendicular to each other. So a good example of that is like if you take an empty Coke can, if you try to squish it perfectly vertically, it's very difficult because the way the can's structured, that's how it's reinforced. It spreads all the tension around through the walls of the can, through the top of the can, through the bottom of the can, and it distributes all the force. So if you want to crush that can, what you do is you focus more of the force on one side of the top. And because the force is no longer evenly distributed, it'll crumple on one side. So that's essentially what's happening with your pelvis. Let's say you have tight hip flexors because you sit all day. That's going to pull everything in the pelvis forward. And what it does is you can think of that almost like an open scissors. And so because those two lines aren't parallel to each other anymore, that force isn't getting evenly distributed, but it's still got to go somewhere. And so if you're not actively stabilizing that core, that force can go to your discs. It can go to your vertebrae. It can go to the ligaments and tendons of your spine, different little things that aren't really designed to support that much force, and that's where injuries occur.
Yeah, that's a really good analogy, and I like when you're able to reduce it to like, because everybody kind of knows that you use your core to brace yourself, but when you simplify it down to like, let's prevent your pelvis from flipping backwards or forward.
Yeah.
Or let's prevent your rib cage from flipping
going up
backwards
or down,
or forward. In that simple term, it really does kind of hit home. Yeah. I feel like
I think it's probably important to I guess differentiate, like when we say like activate the core, it's not like someone's going to punch you in the stomach and you just activate your six pack. It's about kind of like stacking up the barrels where you're not sticking your butt way out and having this huge curvature in your low back, or you're like sticking your chest way up, trying to like, you're not essentially even. You kind of have, kind of like as Dr. Alex was saying, kind of you have like a scissor movement happening. You're just not necessarily stacked on top of each other. So I guess stabilizing the core is not more about just activating your six pack and you're like, oh, I have a six pack and I have it's solid. No, it's more about the positioning of where your pelvis and where your rib cage is.
That's exactly it. Like, that's a perfect way of putting it, Dr. Kevin, is that it's where your diaphragm is, which is at the bottom of your rib cage, and it's where your pelvic diaphragm is, which is essentially at the bottom of your pelvis. And you want those two to be lined up because that's the top and the bottom of your barrel. And many people have that misconception, like Dr. Kevin said, that they think of their abs or they think of their core and they literally just think of the rectus abdominis, the six pack. Well, there's a lot more muscles in there. There's even more muscles in the front. There's a ton of muscles on the side, and there's even muscles that go along into the lower back. And so the idea is when you're bracing your core, not only are you not pulling your abs in, which is what a lot of people will do, that's kind of a common one. If anything, you're pushing your abs out, but it's not just pushing straight out in front of you, it's also pushing out into both your sides, into your obliques. It's about pushing back into your lower back, and then even once you get better at it, it's actually about pushing down into your pelvic floor too. So you can think of it almost like filling up that core with a liquid or something like that. You fill, because air is a liquid, honestly, and it's the same thing, right? You're trying to make like almost like a piston that you fill the fluid in the bottom of your pelvis with your breath, and then you use that to push out into your obliques, push out in the front and back, and that's the base where your pushing off of whenever you do sports or whatever activity you're doing.
That's such a cool concept that, having core stability doesn't necessarily mean just like, oh, okay, I have a shredded six pack, but it's using your body's ability to take in air and basically like harnessing that air and allowing it to help create stability through pressure, right? Otherwise, you're just relying on your spine and the tension of muscles, I guess, but it's kind of a, how do I put this? I mean, you already nailed it. You're using it like a piston.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly. And you're almost like filling in the cracks with like the air. Like kind of where I think you're going is that you can, if you wanted to, you could use your six pack and all of the pressure that you're trying to build up when you're squatting or deadlifting would just go around the sides, right? That pressure is always going to leak out in the weakest link. And if you're not even pushing into the sides or pushing into your lower back, that's where the injuries are going to occur because they just don't have that same stability, that same stabilization. Yeah.
And the other thing that goes along with it is core stability doesn't necessarily mean like you're squatting and the whole time you're holding the most contracted core or abs as possible, right? A lot of times core stability means using the fine tuning or the least amount of like force necessary to keep that everything under control.
Exactly.
But you're not overexerting.
Yeah. But I think the key thing is to know that it's not a primary mover.
Right.
Like I think very commonly we see people, they think a deadlift is an exercise for their lower back.
Mm-hmm.
And quite frankly, no, it frankly shouldn't be moving.
Right, and that's a perfect segue, into why people are running into mistakes with the squat and the deadlift is because it's supposed to act as a base of support. It's not supposed to be the moving.
It's not the primary mover. It's kind of like you're saying. It's the anchor. It's the I guess the platform for which your powerful muscles like your glutes and your hamstrings should be using to fire off of.
Right. So in a way, we're using our core like we would during a plank instead of using our core like we would during a sit-up.
Exactly.
And I think that's a concept that not everybody's familiar with.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Like if you look at a heavy squat or a heavy deadlift, the spine and the angle of the torso shouldn't bend or change at all. Like it should stay completely straight. And I think that's where Dr. Kevin's talking about, that a lot of people think the deadlift is like a lower back movement. So when they bend over, their lower back starts forward, and then once they get to the top, their lower back is pulled all the way back. Whereas in reality, we don't want to stress, the multifidus, the QL, the erectors, all these smaller muscles of the lower back. Their job is to prevent the spine from moving. So you take your deep breath, you brace your core, you make sure that spine is stable, and then again, what do? You use the big muscles of your lower body. You use your glutes, your hamstrings, your quads. Those are the muscles that are supposed to be moving things. You just want to use your core as almost like a seatbelt, just where you're keeping it nice and stiff and you're keeping that area protected, because realistically that is where you're going to get most of the injuries, right? That's where your weakest link is.
I think that's where we see a lot of the common mistakes on a deadlift is I think it goes down to mobility. We don't, I guess maybe we don't, guys especially, I don't think we put enough emphasis on the flexibilities of our hips.
Definitely.
So when you're trying to reach down to get to the barbell, you're like, well, my hips are not going to let me get down there, so you sacrifice the position of your low back to get down further, and then now your back is now involved in the movement as opposed to a place of stability.
Right. So people, exactly, they're not having that hip movement, they don't have that mobility there, so then their spine is starting to buckle to make up for that, and that's exactly what we want to prevent.
And you can totally notice that too if you see somebody at the gym. A lot of times, even if they know what they're doing, but they get to a heavy weight where they're like kind of starting to fail, kind of starting to struggle, they'll start pulling the weight off the ground and it won't move. Like they'll start pulling the tension off, and you can see that their body is like gearing up. It's starting to get that tension through the structures, and you'll see like their legs engage. Sometimes you'll see their hips engage, but the first thing that happens is their butt goes up 100%, and that's because that connection in the lower back isn't stable enough, right? That core bracing isn't sufficient, and so they find a way to make up that extra movement because they don't have that mobility in their hips. And what a lot of people actually find, especially if they are having that common problem, if you're getting that lower back rounding, especially at the beginning of a deadlift, your hips might actually be too low. And that's something that we can kind of touch on in a little bit about kind of the difference between squatting and hinging. But a lot of times, if your hips are starting too low, then you do need to bend way, way over, and your spine just cannot support, you just can't support your spine in that position, right? And so what a lot of people do is actually raising those hips up. That gives your pelvis a better position to brace from, and you're really not moving or flexing that lower back forward and back. All you're doing is squeezing the glutes and hamstrings and keeping that back straight.
Right. Okay. So let's say you do have your hips at the right position. So the first bit of your deadlift, correct me if I'm wrong, you're squatting to your knees.
Exactly,
right?
Yeah.
So your hips in the right position where your back isn't completely buckled or anything like that. So you squat the weight to your knees, and then this is where we get into the second very most common issue. And the first being hips too high up, and they're not able to have that hip mobility to pick it up off the ground.
Yep.
But the next bit is the hip hinge. And this is probably the most foundational movement of the body, period, if we were to take off all the extra from your deadlift and really reduce it down to what is the biggest problem for the most amount of people, the hip hinge. So what is the hip hinge?
So the hip hinge is a way to transfer force from your lower body to your upper body. Like, this is what you do if ever, you're picking up your kid or something like that off the ground, right? You can think of it two ways. You could kind of squat all the way down, you get super, super low, and all your ankles are really dorsiflexed, your knees are super flexed, your hips are super flexed. You're down low, but it's relatively a pretty weak position, right? And so if you're really picking up anything heavier than like your kid or something like that, it's probably not that efficient, right? But the idea is that if you can keep everything solid, and from that standing position, all you do is break at the hips and do a little bit of a hip bend back. You're basically pushing your glutes back. You're storing elastic energy in the glutes, you're storing elastic energy in the hamstrings, and you're keeping your legs fairly straight, not completely straight. And the idea with that as well is that the bar path or whatever you're lifting is going to be either straight vertically or even a little bit into you. And so part of the mechanical advantage of the hip hinge is that you're using your biggest muscles, you're storing that elastic energy as you go down, but then also you're keeping the center of mass or the center of gravity as close to your own center of gravity as possible, right? Mm-hmm. And an easy illustration is trying to, lift something up over your head or trying to lift something straight in front of you, right? With the length of your arm, I don't care how strong you are, like, you're not going to be able to hold a 10-pound dumbbell, very long in front of you, right? Whereas if it's already sitting in your shoulder, or even if it's over your head, right, it's still the length of your arm, but that moment arm, the distance between your center of mass and the center of mass of the dumbbell is a lot closer, and so for your body, it's actually a lot easier. That's the main reason why the hip hinge is so effective. Okay.
So the hip hinge is so effective because it allows you to move the biggest volume or weight close to your body, as close to your body as possible, giving you the biggest mechanical advantage.
Yeah. And utilizing like the most powerful muscles in your body.
Right.
But yeah, simply put, I guess it's just a matter of like when you're bending down and you're coming back up. But it's just a matter of like, where are you bending it? Are you bending at the hips, where the power muscles are? Or are you bending at your back, where frankly they're weak?
Right. So the perfect hip hinge would use your core or your back like you would in a plank, in the sense that none of the movement is happening there. It's teaching your body to move with the hips as your mobile, that's your mobile, area, and your core and your low back as your stable area. And that's the biggest issue, is people either A, don't have the mobility in their hips, or B, don't know how to stabilize their core, or some combination of the two.
So I guess one of the questions I wanted to pose would then be, let's say I want to get down there, but I can't because my hips, my hips are not going to let me get down there. Like, should I then be working on the flexibility of my hips, or should I be working on the strength of my core?
That is a great question.
That's a good question.
That's a great question, because it's kind of both, honestly. Yeah. It really depends individually. Some people will have like an injury, a muscle imbalance, just a general lack of flexibility. Maybe they're getting old, those kind of things. Those will limit your ability to move your hips and to get into that position. But part of it too is that if you can't brace your core properly, your body just can't get into that position, period. We'll see this in the clinic a lot of times. If we get a patient to do a certain movement and it's really tight, it's really bad, we'll just stabilize the area a bit. Like, either we'll physically kind of push that joint into the certain range of motion, or we'll get the patient to push against something. And when they push against something, that forces them to brace their core, and because they have that stability, they no longer have that cannon shooting off a canoe thing. So it's important to work on both, right? You need to loosen tight muscles, you need to strengthen weak muscles, but also that core as an underlying piece is always super important.
Yeah, and I think what you're referring to there is with the SLR, having someone do a straight leg raise on their own, right? If they're able to push off your hand or your arm as support, generally most people can go further, and that's exactly it, like having that base of support. And I also wanted to add to your point there, in that if your spine is buckled, let's say you have an anterior pelvic tilt, meaning you have that over accentuated curve in your low back, your pelvis is tipped forward, well, you don't have as much room to go into flexion, into hip flexion. You've essentially moved the start and finish line of your hip joint, and you've limited it that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect way of describing it. Like, it's almost as if you geared your hips forward 100%. Like, because that pelvis is tilted forward, that's where the hip socket, where the hip attaches, is. Right. And so if that's facing a lot more forward, if you picture yourself leaning way, way forward, there's no way you're going to be able to extend your hip all the way back. And then the opposite problem is also true, right? If your torso is all the way forward, you might get some pinching in the hip, you might not have the mobility, and that's just because everything is just getting smushed in the front because everything's getting tilted forward. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very cool how they play into each other, mobility and stability. Yeah. They gotta be both components.
Exactly. Essentially, like, whenever you see a lack of mobility, you can automatically assume that there's something tight that's restricting it. Sometimes actually a lack of strength, or the lack of stabilization that prevents that movement, as opposed to an actual tightness.
Yes, exactly. And so what we know for weaknesses, we've talked about core, obviously. Glutes would be the next to come, right? And then tightnesses, okay, what kind of tightness is going to truly limit your hip mobility?
A lot of times, like, with that anterior pelvic tilt that we see, this is something that I get from patients all the time. They'll say, I have tight hamstrings, and I've always had tight hamstrings, and I stretch them and they don't get any looser. It's like, okay, all right, let's take a look. So we get them on the table, they're lying on their back. Like Dr. Matt says, we do the straight leg raise test. So literally your leg is just straight, and we see how far you can lift it up. And those listeners of ours who have tight hamstrings probably know it's not going to be very far, right? They're going to feel that pull in the back of their leg, and they're just not going to be able to get it very far. And so
maybe like 45 degrees or something.
Yeah, exactly. Like let's say 45 degrees. And so then I say to the patient, I said, okay, well, let me do it. You relax, I'll hold your leg, and we'll see how far we can get it. And a lot of times you can get it all the way almost to 90 degrees. So the question is, what is that? Why is it that they couldn't do that, but I can, right? It's not that their hip joint isn't allowing it. It's not necessarily even that the muscles are too tight. It's the way that they're firing the muscles just isn't working. They don't have that stability. And so to answer your question, as soon as we get them to brace their core, they push against your shoulder while you're doing that same test, sometimes they can get it even past 90 degrees. And this is a person that has had chronically tight hamstrings for like 20 years or whatever, right? Mm. And so part of that, what's tight, what's limiting that hip mobility, a lot of times it is that hamstring, but the problem isn't tight hamstrings. The problem is that entire pelvis is tilted forward, and so that's when you get that tight hip flexor, you get those tight lumbar erectors, the classic desk posture that everybody has. A lot of times those are what's limiting the mobility.
So and that's a kind of a cool concept, because the muscles that are too tight, or the issues that are too tight, aren't necessarily limiting the hip mobility in itself. They're limiting the position of the frame of the pelvis. So if your low back is super tight and your hip flexors are super tight, again, that's pushing you into the anterior tilt. So again, tightness is contributing to that issue, but it's more so changing the posture of the pelvis rather than the hip. Exactly. Now we're kind of going off on a tangent, but these are all good points.
That's okay, yeah. It's always interesting, right?
Okay, so how do we get someone to hip hinge correctly? I've used some good options. One of them being taking a dowel on the low back, right by the
kind of like having a stick
sacrum.
Behind their back.
Yeah, taking a dowel or a stick.
You like tape them up on
3 points of contact. Yeah, one head, one like mid back region, and right above the pelvis there, right? If you can bend forward and keep that stick against your back, then you're hip hinging.
I actually love that. I think that's a perfect way to do it, because a lot of the issues people have is they do think it's like a flexion extension thing. They think they have to like bend their spine for some reason.
Yeah.
But the first thing that you teach them is you want to brace their spine. So you teach them how to breathe, teach them how to do belly breaths, show them maybe how to brace their core, just so they know what they're supposed to be feeling like. And then you get them off the table, you get that dowel, say exactly like you said, touching their head, their upper back, and their lower back. You say, okay, stick your butt back, keep your legs straight, and don't let the dowel come off your back. And realistically, like as simple as that sounds, that's a perfect hip hinge. There's a few other things that you can kind of work on. Like a lot of times, more in like a deadlift, I like having the shins vertical or as straight as possible. The knees can be a little bit bent. The thighs are obviously going to come back a little bit as you sit your butt back. But really, all you're doing is keeping your lower legs straight, sitting your butt back, and then squeezing your butt to bring it back forward again.
I think sometimes even just like a mentality change. I think a lot of people are under the conception that if you're standing, your glutes are supposed to just stay there and not be active, and so what you bend is actually through your back, which is incorrect actually. While you're standing, and you're using your core to brace your torso and the rest of your upper body, it's actually your glutes that's firing to kind of bring you back and forth.
I agree. And I think that what people are uncomfortable with is shifting their center of gravity backwards to counterbalance them leaning forward to get down. Mm-hmm. So, it's like, it just seems novel. People aren't used to shifting their center of gravity backwards, and in order to prevent that, they just want to just use their spine to go forward.
Like I think most people can understand that your glutes, kick your legs backwards.
Yeah.
But like if your legs are locked,
Yeah,
like
what are you
cemented
gonna
to the
do?
ground, like do they do any work? Yes, they still do a lot of work in terms of propelling the other half of your body the same way. And I don't think you see this very classically in the gyms where, you see that guy who's like, propelled off that bench. I don't know what you call that. Is that kind of like where your legs are kind of strapped in and then your torso's off.
Yeah. The 45 like hyperextension.
Hyperextension.
Yeah.
And they think that's like all back.
Yes.
And it's like no, that's an exercise for your glutes.
Yeah. Okay, that's a great illustration, Kevin, because that's exactly what you were talking about. Is that people are afraid to hinge their hips back and stick their butts out and actually use their glutes, right? You have all seen this exact guy that Kevin's talking about, is that he's got his legs strapped in and his back's already straight, and then he goes even farther back from like already the end, right? His back's straight, you're not hinging at all, and somehow they basically just torque their lower back. Yeah, they just overextend, right? They torque their back into more extension when in reality the hinge is everything in front of that. It's going all the way down and coming back to that position rather than that little bit of extra extension at the top.
Right. So yeah. But I don't know how I feel about this as far as, so of course when you're doing any kind of major movements, you're pushing big weight, you want to use your hip hinge. Mm-hmm. Do you think there's any value in just going through that concentric movement through your spine? You're getting off 45 degrees, you're laying, your pelvis is off. You're not teaching yourself how to hip hinge, but you're putting your spine through a concentric extension to flexion. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You're letting your spine wave more or less.
Right.
I feel like there might be value in that. In a controlled environment, you're not doing this with weight. This is just to get your spine used to, dealing with that momentum, because we do always try to use our spine or as a stable, as a stable area. We want to keep it as straight as possible so we can use our arms and our legs. Well, what if we're taking our arms and legs out of the equation? I think there might be some value to just teaching your spine how to move on its own.
Inevitably, like with any extension, it's known that your glutes are your primary extensor, but like, your back is always involved in a bit of it too. It is the major stabilizer, but then it also does a little bit as kind of like a backup system, right? It provides a little bit, and so there is some worth in training it, but the core's main ability is to stabilize.
Right, and you don't want to be teaching bad habits either. Yeah. And essentially, anytime you're using your arms or your legs, you want to be using your core.
As a stabilizer, not as a mover.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I like generally I would say that, because people are always scared to flex their spines. They're like, oh my god, like I'm gonna get a disc herniation or like these different things. So flexing your spine in the way that Matt's describing is only dangerous if it's under a compressive load, specifically. Mm-hmm. So even like a deadlift, it's kind of like a gray area, but that's not even a compressive load. It's not as big of a deal. We're talking about like a squat. You wouldn't want the bar on your back and going through that flexion. Like that is an absolute recipe for disaster. But if you do it unloaded, your spine is really meant to be like pretty damn mobile. Like even though you're supposed to try to stabilize it whenever you do any of these sports or any of these activities, like if you look at somebody who is really flexible and can do like a front bend standing up where their face is like at their knees, that is totally fine. That's totally fine. Going through that flexion extension cycle of the lumbar spine is actually good. Even it helps the discs cycle through fluid, like that kind of stuff.
This is true. Yeah.
I'm also thinking, like, as much as we do use our spine as that stable base, that foundation, there are also times where we use it to create like a recoil effect. Like if I'm throwing a kick, right? I'm going to be rotating my body, extending my body, right? And you almost use that spine bending like a coil.
Yeah, kind of like an elastic, like a spring.
Yeah, you're building up kinetic energy in your core and then you're letting it loose, right? Mm-hmm. So there are times when you are going to use the spine's movement to develop energy and strength, but you don't, people, especially if you're doing big lifts, that's not something you want to do.
Yeah.
And generally people are doing that too much and not relying on their shoulders or their hips enough as opposed to, the other way around.
Yeah, I completely agree. And like your example, you're a Muay Thai fighter, you're throwing a kick. First of all, you don't have a bar on your back. It's not compressing those discs. You don't have to worry about any of those things. And then on top of that, yeah, you're throwing a kick, and yeah, you want some snap, you want some elastic energy storage, that's all good, but you're also not going to completely relax your abs. If any fighter, when they go to kick, if you looked at the way that their core is braced, it's super solid. And that is exactly what we're talking about. That's how you transfer that energy from the lower body to the upper body. Because if you tried to do that and your core wasn't braced, then you probably wouldn't even be able to move at all, right? So it's all relative, right? Like that elasticity, that recoil, perfect for some sports, but you still want to supplement it a little bit with core bracing, that kind of thing, right?
Right. Still bracing your core,
yeah.
Right? Trying to throw a kick, imagine your low back's the only thing working and not your abs. Right?
Yeah.
How do you build that recoil, that elastic energy in that case? You just don't. Because you have a loose end on one end, right? So, all very good concepts to get right into. So we've talked a lot about deadlifting. The next thing up on the menu that we need to hit is squats. So what is the mechanical advantage of squatting over deadlifting? And why is it foundational?
So the main mechanical advantage, we talked about the deadlift using the big lower body muscles, and we talked about specifically the glutes, the hamstrings, not really the lower back, but kind of the lower back. Whereas the squat is really the most efficient way to use your leg muscles, right? Again, it's it's your quads, it's your calves, it's your hamstrings. That's the way that you're going to be able to explosively transfer power for whatever sport you're doing, right? When you're doing a deadlift or a hinge, if you look at the actual joint angles, the joint angles don't move that much. They're not as big as they would be in a deep squat, right? Where you have that dorsiflexion, that knee flexion, that hip flexion. So it's part of that is just getting muscle recruitment and getting a solid motor pattern in a different range of motion with different joint angles.
Totally. Yeah. And any time you're pushing off, trying to propel yourself, a squat's going to come into that.
Yeah,
right?
it's the best way for you to learn to use your legs for whatever it is that you're going to do. And part of that is with the bracing, part of that's with mobility and flexibility, that kind of thing too. But yeah, that's the way that you learn to use your legs properly, squatting.
And you just take advantage of literally all the power in your legs, because it involves the ankle joints, the knee joints, the hip joints. Whereas deadlift is primarily just the hip joints. So here we have a 3 joints to 1.
Exactly. And a lot of these, the difference between a hinge and a squat is more applicable to a lot of more explosive movements, a lot more sports, that kind of thing. Just as Kevin's saying, if you were to try to jump as high as you could, you looked at that in slow motion as you were coming up, you get that classic triple extension that we see in sports, right? In throwing and jumping and all those things. You get the ankles, your toes pointing down, that's using your calves. You get the straightening of those knees, which is the quads and the hamstrings. You still get that extension of the hip, which is the glute and the lower back. So it's really, there are some similarities and some differences between the squat and the deadlift, definitely.
Yes, yeah. And I like to think, if squat's on the top of the pyramid, coming down from that, jumping, skating, running, you name it, any kind of exercise, can kind of foundationally taken back to that. So, I mean, it's a different movement, but the error in it is often the same. The big issue with it that people run into is often the same, which is the pelvic positioning, pelvic control. It's still an issue of people are not keeping their spine a stable place, buckling forward, buckling backwards.
Exactly. Like a super common one in the squat, probably lots of people have heard of this before, is the concept of the butt wink. That you can keep your spine straight down to a certain depth, and then as soon as you go past that depth, your butt tucks under. So why does this happen? Part of this is the shape of the anatomy of your hip socket and your hip joint. The biggest thing though, again, is just that anterior pelvic tilt, that office worker position that we talk about again and again. But if you're compromising your core in order to have that open scissors position, that anterior pelvis position, and you can't properly brace, then that butt wink is a direct sign of that loss of stability, right? You can see as they go down into that butt wink that lumbar spine flexes forward, and you're getting a ton of tension all through the discs, all through the multifidi, all the ligaments in the lower back, and really it's just kind of that weakest link that shows up again.
Right. And for our listeners, when he says butt wink, it's literally you get to the bottom of your squat and your pelvis starts to curl underneath you.
Yeah.
It starts to kind of wrap underneath you. And you brought up a good point, which is there is functional reasons why you... So basically when you're squatting, once you're butt winking, you've gone far deep enough, your body, you physically aren't ready to go any further.
Yeah.
The way to fix that, well, there can be functional reasons, right? Core stability or hip mobility, more or less. You might not be ready to go any further because there's some work to do there. Or, option B, you structurally aren't built to go as deep as the other guy. And this is also a very interesting topic, is what are the main things that are going to dictate your structural depth?
So the main two things are the depth of the acetabulum, as it's called, which is the actual socket of the hip. And in the hip, it's pretty deep. And then the ball of your hip socket, which is on your femur, right, your thigh bone, when those come together, that interaction between that ball and socket will dictate where your hips should be when you squat, how deep you can go, all those kind of things. In general, if that hip socket is really, really deep, then there's almost like a little ring of bone that stops that thigh from moving. That person isn't going to be able to squat as deep, but it also makes them stronger in kind of those middle ranges. Whereas some other people that have a really, really shallow hip socket, they might be able to get into a really, really low position, but they don't have that same strength because they don't have the bones supporting it, right? So it's a lot of the way that you were born, a lot of the way you were made.
Yeah, super cool concept that we are literally born with structural differences. And there's a demographic too, which we find more of that Western European will have the deeper sockets, and you can find most other places, and particularly Eastern Europe, will have a shallower hip socket, can squat much deeper. But the cool thing, sorry, I'm losing my headspace here. Oh yeah, another thing you'll notice is people that do have that deeper hip socket, when they go into that squat, their feet will be more forward, right? You get
that's. I mean, there's so much to unpack on that one.
Right.
Yeah, because the physical structure of our femurs, the acetabulum, with the direction that the acetabulum is facing, it can dictate a lot in terms of. So I mean, there's so much information out there right now in terms of what a perfect squat looks like, and there's a lot you can do in trying to improve mobility. But frankly, sometimes if your anatomy's not going to let you get the quote unquote ideal squat, then that's as far as you go.
And that's why it may be useful to work with a professional to find out what your squat is going to be, because it's going to be specific to everyone, right? Like I have a shallow hip socket, so I do point my toes a little bit outwards when I'm going into that deep squat, and the reason being it provides more clearance for me at the hip to use that full range of the squat. I'm basically taking my hips away from just smacking the top of the bone there of my acetabulum, which is the socket of my femur.
And that's a great way to put it. Like, in order to squat to a certain depth, like you're saying, you kind of use it to clear your hips out of the way, and that's 100% true. Like, if you have someone with deep hip sockets, they need to get their legs out of the way so that they can squat. But because of the bone that's keeping the hips pointed forward, they can't bring their hips out. So what do? They push their knees more in front. Whereas someone like you said, your toes are turned a little bit farther out, your hips are set wider out, your knees have that diagonal or that horizontal area to travel. Whereas with you, if you try to squat with a close stance with your feet close together, pushing those knees out really far in front, that probably wouldn't work for you either, right?
Right.
Because you need to get the hips and the knees out of the way somehow. So you either do that forward, or you do that to the side, or a mix of both.
And you made a good point when you said people with deep hip sockets will tend to have to kind of push their knees forward more. Well, then you'll find these people are also leaning very much forward because it puts more need on their body to counterbalance by shifting their weight backwards, which can be very hard.
It can be, and that is a great way to put it, is to counterbalance. Like if you looked at a really good squatter from the side and you cut them in half right down the middle of their foot, chances are that 50% of their body mass would be behind that middle line, and 50% of their body mass would be in front of that line. And it's same with the hinge too, right? Is that as soon as part of your body goes forward, part of your body has to go back to counterbalance. And it seems pretty obvious, but it's just, a lot of people don't really pick up on that, and a lot of people don't really fully understand that. And once you kind of have that front back balance, a lot of times it can be
but obviously
pretty effective.
That affects what the ideal squat form looks like for you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because if sometimes your head might lean way forward to try and counteract the weight of the shifting of your hips backwards, but when in fact a lot of people would call that inappropriate, or you're sacrificing your back, but actually that might be appropriate for you. It all really depends on the anatomy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And part of this is not to say like, you were dealt a bad hand, sorry man, you got these bad hip sockets, you'll never be able to squat this way. It's not quite like that. It's more about taking advantage of what's the best style for you based on your structure. And then on top of that, your function can improve or get a little worse, kind of within that range. You can always make asymmetries go away. You can always stretch tight muscles. You can always strengthen weak muscles. You can always do this to improve your squat and change the way that you're doing it a little bit. And you might get a little lower, you might get a little wider, like whatever it is that you're trying to work on. But mimicking somebody else's style verbatim a lot of times isn't helpful, because you just don't have the same bones as them.
100%. Yeah, 100%. And that's why not everybody's going to be an ass to grass squatter. No. Not everybody, and it's more important to realize that everybody's different. Everyone's squat can be slightly different than assume that because you can't get that low it's an issue, or that you need to force it. And sometimes you just go as far as you can maintain a good form, and that's enough. Like that should be enough, and as you work on things you'll be able to get lower. But I thought that was just a really cool point that I wanted to kind of bring up once again, is if you draw a line front to back, 50% of their weight behind them and 50% in front of them. And the cool thing about that is when you turn your legs out and bring your legs more to the side, right, when you have that foot flaring outwards, that shifts that weight closer to the center line, and therefore puts less demand on you to try and counterbalance. Really cool concept. So that alone can dictate, you know, how deep they can go.
And that's part of it too, like really taking into conception, you know, a lot of people think of like a stick figure, that a stick figure is squatting up and down, but it's not 2-dimensional, it's 3-dimensional. And so just because you can't push your knees straight forward doesn't mean like, oh well, I can't squat. It's like, well, you can push them out at an angle. Or once you get really wide, then you're right, you bring that center of mass closer to that center line, and then you don't have that as large of a deviation front and back kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons why someone it doesn't feel comfortable shifting their weight backwards by hinging and kind of pushing back is because they have underdeveloped glutes as well.
Yeah. Yeah, core bracing, underdeveloped glutes.
Part of it, yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. Wow. Well, we really unpacked a lot with this one. A final point is, so not only is this foundational for all those reasons we've listed above, you know, you're using these in all these different types of movements, this is the most efficient way to move, you're preventing injury, you're optimizing performance, but also you're teaching your body joint sense. You're teaching your body proprioception, it's called, to be able to, your body knows exactly where your arms and your legs and your joints are positioned at any given time, right? So this is exercising and doing your squats and deadlifts is the best way to train your nerves.
Yeah, it's a fantastic way to ingrain those motor patterns, especially if you're doing it really heavy. Once you get good at it, it can really affect the firing of the nervous system. It affects the order with which the muscles fire. Mm-hmm. And that concept of proprioception is very, very valuable because you can think of that as the most constant stream of information going directly into not even just your brain, but your spinal cord at all times. And you know, if you watch somebody do a really heavy squat or a really heavy deadlift, sometimes that'll take 4, 5, 6 seconds. You can see them adjusting their joint angles. You can see them feeling out the weight essentially because the weight's giving them feedback back, right? In their brain, they're like, okay, I can feel the way my knee feels, I can feel how my hips are feeling, okay, contract the glutes, like brace the core, like it's one of the few things that's a real-time input directly to your own brain about your own performance. And if you can learn to harness that, there's almost nothing more effective for sport performance than learning how to feel your own body.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and your body's really good at finding out what puts you in balance.
Yeah, it knows. It'll look for that, and you know the feeling when you're about to lose balance or you slip and fall, like you have that mini heart attack, and that's your spinal cord like immediately signaling to you like, hey buddy, you just slipped on something, your balance is off, you're about to fall, you better stick out your other leg in order to catch yourself, stuff like that. Like that's a perfect example of the proprioceptive system.
Mm-hmm. And squatting and deadlifting, these big compound movements, train it better than anything. Like they really train it quite well. Another cool idea of just your body trying to find balance is if you see someone squatting a lot of times, let's say their right foot is pointing outwards a little more than it should be, while their left foot might point inwards a little bit to try and normalize that. And then your whole pelvis is kind of shifting to compensate for that. And eventually your whole body is tuned a little degrees this way and that way to try and bring you back to center line. To try and bring you back to, you know, what it thinks is balance, perfect balance.
Yeah, and that's a great way to kind of try to reverse that, because you're right, like your brain gets this information from your muscles, from your joints, from your tendons, from the joint capsules, like a lot of this information, and a lot of times it will just feel that things feel the same on both sides because the tissues are tighter, or because the pelvis is tilted on that side, or because that right foot is flared out a little bit more. And that's where, you know, going to see an expert to get that analyzed. A lot of times video review will show you those things. And that's when you kind of have to work a little bit against that proprioceptive system, that you're like, okay, I know how it feels in my brain, but it's got to look this way. And if anything, you can then use your proprioceptive system, you know, to do like 10-second eccentric squats or something like that, like where you're really feeling the way that your feet feel, the way your knees feel, the way your hips feel, and essentially rewriting that old program that was flawed. You rewrite it with new relevant information with this proprioceptive system.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then just talking about it, it becomes very evident that there's so much to unpack here. And Dr. Fitzwidge, power lifter, does these big lifts, and he knows that this is something that you can go into great detail with. But it's still important to get that first step. For no matter who you are, this is relevant, right? Maybe you're not going into the most amount of detail,
Right.
but no matter what you do day to day, whether you're an athlete or not, getting this foundation set is going to keep you out of our office. It's just gonna make your life way easier. You're gonna be better at anything athletic. You're not gonna get hurt as much. It's just what you need to do, kind of.
Kind of like you said, like you use it every day, whether you're picking up your groceries, bending down, tie your shoes, these kind of movements, you'll see it in everything you do, not just in the gym.
Walking, running, anything. Getting up from sitting.
Yeah.
All right, well, that covers a lot today, so let's probably leave it at that. Thank you to all our listeners again for the support. Appreciate it, and I hope you found some value out of this today.